All right? That was one section, and I want to take the second half of this lesson, which actually deals with Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah and Shoftim, for those of you familiar with this portion of Shoftim, there is nothing in this week's portion of the Torah that deals with Rosh Hashanah. Read it backwards, frontwards, and you will find nothing on Rosh Hashanah. And yet, I can tell you that if you decide to read the Zohar, we've got about 6 pages on Rosh Hashanah, which stems from partial aspect of Rosh Hashanah, stems from this week's portion. Is there a Chumash? In this week's portion, discussing the matter of witnesses. Witnesses. This is Deuteronomy. Chapter 19 and verse 15. One witness shall not rise up against the man for any iniquity or for any sin, in any sin that he sinneth. Can you imagine?
Do you mind to repeat that, please?
It's so difficult. I agree with you. I couldn't begin to understand this if I had to translate it this way. And why it's ever translated that way, I guess, creates more confusion than an interpretation. But in any event, I've merely read the usual corruptive translation. But if I'll go straight to the Torah, we'll have something else. Anyway, one man cannot act as a witness in declaring the inequity or the sin of another individual. In other words, if someone committed a crime, one witness is not sufficient to have justice meted out. There must be, as it continues to say, al pi shnei edim. There must be 2 witnesses. O al pi shlosha edim yakum davar. Or the matter shall be established through 3 witnesses. Now obviously, if it says that one witness is not sufficient, do we not understand that we need 2? But maybe 2 is not enough. You might need 3. So therefore, there's a necessity of saying 2 or 3. But why does it have to say 2 is okay and 3 is okay? I can tell you that there is a Talmud containing about 140 pages that discusses this matter at length. But if you haven't got all that time to go through those 140 pages, because the Talmud deals at a level which is the level of the illusionary physical reality, because things of crime do occur and has to be dealt with. And so the Talmud makes every effort, but certainly not from this one sentence, but they themselves read into the deeper meaning, even the Talmud, which deals purely on a physical reality realm, goes to great lengths to interpret this one verse so as to ensure that proper justice is meted out. The Zohar doesn't really need that much, because not that the Zohar in any way surpasses the Talmud, or that the Talmud is inferior, but rather both are dealing on different levels. One is dealing with the illusionary level, the corporeal level, and I say illusionary because I'm a firm believer in physics. They say that whatever anybody sees, that's what it is. And if two people see the same thing and both claim they've seen something else or different than the other, they're both right. So you can imagine the confusion that can exist on a physical level. So the sages of the Talmud, with their infinite wisdom, took everything into account, and that's why from this one verse there was a requirement of expanding. The physical reality is so illusionary and confusing because it's illusionary. But once you get into the real world, the reality realm, the 99%, not the one we are maybe unaccustomed or that we don't deal with regularly, the real world is not confusing. So the Zohar, in several pages, can explain and interpret this one verse concisely, precisely, without confusion, no disagreements. In fact, it really boils down to some essential disciplines that we can all, in fact, even agree, because when it comes to any matter that deals with the physical, corporeal reality, nobody can ever stand up and say, I'm right. No. According to the Talmud, there was a quarrel between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. One said permitted, one said forbidden, and this concept that today is quantum was known to the Talmud a long, long time ago, long before these physicists became confused. Only in their confusion did they come up. If they're confused, then everybody's confused. You know, it reminds me of a story they tell about this peasant who worked on this in Russia on this lord's farm, and he was Jewish, and he was amongst 200 non-Jewish peasants that worked for this lord. And the Lord was going away for a couple of weeks, and the other non-Jewish peasants figured, well, this was a good way to have some fun. They got this mushka, and that's the way they used to call him, took this mushka, filled him up with a little liquor, didn't know where he was, and carried him into the Lord's bed. He wakes up in the morning, and can't believe what he sees. He is lying in the Lord's bed. Gives himself a pinch. He feels it. Seems like he's in the physical reality. But it can't be. He knows it can't be. How he got there, he doesn't know, but he knows it can't be. So he rings the bell, because he at various times was the butler for the Lord. Rings the bell. In come 3 butlers. What can we do for you, my lord? Can't believe this. Okay. He says, bring me breakfast in bed and get my clothes ready. Yes, sir. All happens. Then he knows that the Lord, right after breakfast, would take his daily horseback ride, which he could also do. Gave his command, and there was the Lord's horse. And this goes on a couple of weeks. But he's enjoying it. Not so bad anyway. One day he goes into a room that he didn't recognize. Never saw it before. We would call it the library. Goes into the library and starts to observe there are things like this. He doesn't even know what this is. Picks it up. Goes this way, goes that way, turns it upside down. He can't make head or tail because he doesn't know how to read. He never read in his life, never saw a book. He says, now I know that I'm not the Lord. Because if I was the Lord, I'd be able to handle and deal with these things. But then on second thought, even if I wasn't the Lord probably couldn't read this either. So that Makes me the same like him. He can't read, neither can I. And that's how he proved he was the Lord, you see. Because nobody else could read. That's what I say about physicists. It's become so confused. Why are things so confused? I hate to tell you what they say about the universe. It's a free universe. Everything goes. That even if you, to the point that if you commit murder, you can go and tell somebody the one you thought you saw is not me. Getting back to the Talmud, it said that Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, one said forbidden, which was usually Bet Shammai, and Bet Hillel, who said it was permitted. And the Talmud says, Elu ve'elu divra lekim chayim. They're both correct. How can they both correct? Either yes or no. Both are correct. The Talmud doesn't raise that question, but the Zohar does. And the Zohar's response to that question is as follows. You see Beit Shammai? That he doesn't say it in those words, but he says the internal characteristic of Beit Shammai was of kaf small, of a negative quality. They were negative. They were pessimistic on everything. This was their internal characteristic, and I would say the 99% of Beit Shammai. Bet Hillel, says the Zohar, was of kav yamin. That was their internal, intrinsic characteristic. One of a positive nature. Positive nature, you're optimistic, and everything else that goes along with a positive characteristic. Therefore, they would always say permitted Hillel. They always saw the lighter side of things, whereas in a negative way, you see the darker side. This was the Zohar's interpretation. This was the Zohar's interpretation, that when things are dealt on a physical, corporeal level, what do you observe? That's not what's true. The internal characteristics, that's the real world. The stuff you don't see with the naked eye. The stuff that even your mind, the conscious mind, cannot even observe. You need an altered state of consciousness to be in another place. But if you're stuck and your feet can't get off the ground, then you can never appreciate that other realm, that beautiful realm, the real realm. Therefore, the Zohar, which deals with the real world, the world of metaphysics, the 99% of existence in everything. And so, in dealing with this particular verse, the Zohar says, again, a precept, Mitzvah zu hi le'id edut bebet din. This is a precept that if you know and you can bear witness, if you saw an act, you're required to make testimony. Shelo yafsid chavero kesef b'shvil she'eino meid. In other words, if he saw the A lending B money, he was a witness to that transaction, and then B says, I never got the money, A must come forth. If he knows, he must come forth. However, ve'ein edut pachut mishnayim. But in that kind of testimony, you must have at least two people. And I won't go into the reasons for the two people. Now, what about the fact that it says, O al pi shlosha edim yakum davar? Three people. 2, 3. Either 3 or 2. The question we raised before. So the Zohar says, these matters that are dealt with in courts are the illusionary aspects. Why? Because when you're already in that physical court, that show has been played out long before that physical transaction and that physical presence in court ever began. It's no different than the way we think and do and act. What comes first? Physical, corporeal reality must always follow something of a metaphysical nature. Began elsewhere, began with thought. So I use the word thought, energy, intelligence. Thought prompted and initiated that physical corporeal reality. Something which is almost unseen, like the seed of a tree. Seed of a tree. The unseen tree is all there, of course. But we don't see it, of course. The stuff that's real is the stuff that belongs to the concealed world. The paradox. That's the way things must operate. The soul and the body. Hand rises, descends. The body decided all this? Of course not. We all know that prior thought. We're so accustomed to that, but we just don't carry it far enough. We carry it to the extent of where our noses can smell. Nothing further than that. To go into a cosmos and say, you know what? That eruption, that solar eruption, came about for only one reason. I disrupted a family's life yesterday. Oh, come on. But that's what Genesis 2 tells us. When it says that Adam gave names to everything, and he gave names. Why did they take their own names? And why didn't the Lord give the names? And why did he give the particular names, asked the Zohar? All of these things in Genesis 2, not Genesis 1. Genesis 2. Why? The answer is man. Man is the ruler and controller of this entire cosmos. Everything. Whatever happens, whatever subsequently becomes manifested on a physical level, began with a prior thought. Not only the stealing of man, but he had to think before he was going to steal. That thought energy, that thought intelligent energy, is what roams around in this cosmos and creates the havoc that we experience. So what happened in that court began somewhere else, long before the physical pieces were put together. So the Zohar says, this pasuk, this verse, is dealing with Rosh Hashanah, because there is no other explanation as to why it says 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses. What did the verse want with that, or even 1 witness? Why does it have to say that 1 witness is not enough? Couldn't it just merely say 2 witnesses are required? Wouldn't I then understand that 1 witness was not sufficient? Wouldn't I then understand that 3 witnesses were certainly sufficient if the requirement was 2 witnesses? So there's so much redundancy or superfluous activity going on in this verse. So obviously we do not treat the verse as a written word. There's thought energy going in here. And that's what we want to understand. But you can't understand things unless they become enclosed even in words. Can you understand my thoughts if you didn't hear them? There are others that could. Extrasensory perception. We know it exists. It exists more with others, less with some. But that it exists. We all have the experience of ESP, but we're not even conscious that it occurred. We have other reasons that we can attribute to why that particular thing happened. Does it mean that's the reason? Yeah, because I said so, it must be the reason. In any event, it's long for explanation. I hope we can complete it. Anyway, the Zohar says like this. Rosh Hashanah. What happens? What's Rosh Hashanah? Rosh Hashanah is the time that the world returns to its original period of creation. You know, like the sun the moon, and all of us, we come from somewhere, we go back somewhere. But everything is in transit and everything is like a circle. Everything comes back to the place where it came from. That's what happens on Rosh Hashanah. All of the cosmos, everything in it, is returned to its former position of that moment of creation. That moment of creation was when? The fourth day of creation. Rosh Hashanah is on the fourth day of creation. That's when it began. The creation that we know began on the fourth day. Why? Because on the fourth day, it says that the moon became a lesser light. Now, of course, we do not interpret the Torah in a literal sense that it became a lesser light. In fact, the moon has no light at all, except that light which it receives from the sun. So what do you mean a lesser light? Well, we could say that when it does stand in that facing position with the sun, it has a little light, and that reflection of the moon is not as strong as the sun, and this is where the interpretations of the moon and sun came about. However, from a Kabbalistic point of view, we're discussing Zeir Anpin and Malchut. What does that mean? It means simply that Zeir Anpin, that Malchut, the moon, before day 4, shined in equal brilliance as the sun. On day 4, the moon lost all of its brilliance, all of its light. I won't go into what happened, why we even know that too. But what we are concerned with is what caused it. What caused it? What does the sun represent, and what does the moon represent, states the Zohar. The sun is Kav Yamin, the right column. What he means, right column? In other words, Shabtai Danalo, when he tells us so clearly the forces and everything that exists on the sun, can you imagine that Shabtai Danalo, only 900 years ago, already had a capsule that he can travel to the sun and investigate and explore the sun and come back and tell us exactly what happens on that sun? It's incredible, or he's a fake. One of the two. Despite the fact that he was an astronomer, and despite the fact that he was an astrologer, and despite the fact that he was a physician, and despite the fact that there were other credits to his name. But he was a fake, we can say. You can't say that. But in any event, this man stated, and he learned that, and he did contact the sun. First of all, if there's extraterrestrial intelligences on the sun, so what's so difficult? Why can't we talk to them? If I can talk to you, I can talk to the guy on the sun. In any event, the sun is characteristic of the right column. Why? It's the energy provider for the universe. That's in fact why Shabtai Danalo tells us why all planets rotate around the sun. Now, we shouldn't even raise that question because it has not been raised yet in science. Maybe another 500 years, they may even begin to question, why do all the planets rotate around the sun? Anyway, Shabtai Danalo told us because they're all looking for their nourishment. You know, you ever see cats with a piece of meat? Everybody flocks to the place where you can get your bread. That's how simple Shabtai Danalo declares the energy intelligence of the sun. But it's too simple. So remember, the simpler it gets, it becomes a problem. You know, it's like I had a friend in from Ann Arbor, Michigan. He prays in the Reformed temple, which he has left now. Because he went over to the rabbi. He said, "Rabbi, what happens tomorrow if the Messiah comes?" He says, "I'll be out of a job." In other words, it's a problem. You see, things get too simple. I mean, can you imagine if the Messiah came, there was peace on earth and goodwill towards men? But that might put some people out of a job. So better off that let the confusion reign. There'll be a necessity for rabbis and physicians and everybody else. Because if that happens, things have to change. We all might have to look for a new profession. The simpler it gets, you're closer to reality. It's the corporeal level, says the Zohar, the Talmud level, which is necessary. I don't mean to in any way downgrade it, because we must know what the Talmud says concerning any of these precepts, because we wouldn't get to the heart of the issue. But at least understand that the action is not on that physical, corporeal reality level. So, what is the internal energy force of the sun? Zeir Anpin. See, we have a name for that thought, energy, intelligence, called Zeir Anpin. That's the sun. On day 4, Nukva is what? The energy, intelligence of the desire to receive. That's the force of that moon. Long before, and in fact, I only read an article recently. So what happened with all of these explorations on the moon? Have we in any way benefited mankind or improved the quality of our well-being now that we spent all that money and now we know what the moon is all about? Now what? And they said nothing. Nothing. But it did give, and I must say that was one of the benefits. More people work. Now they could examine the rocks, see what they contain, how it might benefit mankind. Maybe. You never can tell. He says no. The Zohar says that energy, thought, intelligence, because 99% is thought energy. A proton is not an inanimate thing. How do the scientists, physicists speak about a table? Do you know the cosmic dance that goes on in that table? Wow! A dance of millions of intelligences. Maybe not physical people, but millions of a dance. Movement. This table is not dead. It's not inanimate. There's no such thing. A new revelation. A new revelation. According to the Zohar, they're still in the dark ages, because they're trying to convince us that we are now in total randomness. You know what that means, total randomness? Total confusion. Things happen without a cause because they do not observe the cause. Because you can't see it. Do you know what's going on? What's the energy intelligence of the moon? How do you begin? Zohar says, I know what it is. It's a desire to receive. Desire to receive. It's the opposite of the sun. The opposite of the sun. Therefore, the moon also rotates, and all of the other planets, because they lack a certain component that the sun, which is a composite of all of the elements that everything else in this universe has a necessity for. So that's what happened with Malchut. The desire to receive, however, it became a lesser light. What does that mean? This desire to receive no longer came in contact, you see, with the sun. Both elements are necessary. Can you can you have a bulb or a circuit in a bulb without a positive pole and negative pole? Of course not. You need both. So with everything. But what happened on the fourth day of creation, Genesis 1, not Genesis 2, but the fourth day of creation, Malchut, which was representative and symbolized and contained the energy, thought, intelligence of desire to receive, left column, became black. Why did it become black? Because it had no contact, you see. It had no contact with the sun. That's why the psalmist says about Rosh Hashanah, the first day of Rosh Hashanah, Bekesa liyom chagenu. This is the verse recited all over the world for those who still attend. The word Tiku b'chod shofar. We should laugh because 60%, 70% no longer have any affiliation. They're all wrong and we're right. Those who attend are right. It's like I say about the insane and the sane. You'll read in that new book I'm putting out the difference between the sane man and the insane man. The sane guy, he's the guy who prepares his vacation 6 months in advance, right? And flies off and there's engine trouble and he sits on the plane for 7 hours, right? He finally gets to the hotel where he's reserved on the Riviera, a front view of the Mediterranean, but due to an overbooking, they give him the room in the cellar, right? And what is he going to do? And he comes down to the dining room. He happens to get the worst waiter, who the first day pours a bowl of soup over him. You see? And he finally gets back after 3 weeks of vacation. He finally comes back, right? Whereas the insane guy in that mental institution, he's ordered his chauffeur to take him to the Riviera. He pulls up. This is all in the mind. It's all in the mind. He pulls up at the hotel. What a reception. Seven people come out because he's arrived. He gets the best room in the house, obviously. Served like a king. What could he expect? No plane problem. He decided he had enough of the vacation, no reservations. He's back. And now what are the doctors trying to do? They're going to have to see how they can destroy that piece of tranquility to get him back to normalcy, you see. Right? What's right, what's wrong? What's right and what's wrong? It becomes a little confusing, like the physicist says. It could be confusing. In any event, this is what happened on day one. The internal energy intelligence of the moon, which was negative, no longer could tap its source of energy, which was the sun, which was the Irampin. Sun is only a physical representation to give us an idea. Everyone can understand there is a force in this universe which is just giving. What does the sun take from everybody else? Well, we can kind of agree it takes nothing. All it does is it shares and distributes its own energy, right? And therefore, on Rosh Hashanah, I won't go through it because it's all down on the tape. I'll have to skip part of it because I want to get to the essence. So we asked, he asked, Amai mitkasetet? Why on this day do we recite this verse, I should say, that on this first day of Tishrei, the month of Libra, it's called a concealed month. Concealed month? Every first day of every month, the moon is in its same position. Why is this month different? And King David said, this month is concealed. But every month, the first day you don't see the moon. It is only after a couple of hours or maybe even a day or two that we can begin to observe the moon. And yet the psalmist says, on the first day of Tishrei, it is black. It is black. We know why. Because on this day, the root, the source of darkness became established in the cosmos. Negative energy that was not being fulfilled. You know what happens when there is a desire? A man has to feed his family and he can't get that money up to buy bread. He's got the desire, he's got the support, the need, and the responsibility, but he can't. That happened at its root source when? On Rosh Hashanah. Because subsequently, during the year, it didn't feel. The further away from the accident. You ever pass an accident on the road? A terrible accident? The minute you see that accident, what do you do with the brake? Down goes the foot, right? What happens to further remove from the accident? Your foot goes up. You already forgot 3 minutes later what you saw. Should you be careful? Gone and forgotten. That's both on a physical level, obviously, and on a metaphysical level. That's the way our minds work. That's why it's dark. But why did it become like that? because of the aspect of bread of shame, because of free choice, because man should have a choice. If there was never a day that he would have to give a reckoning, in other words, his deeds, they call Satan, that's Satan over there, the guy in Germany, that bad one there. You know what the Zohar calls Satan? Me, you, and everybody has Satan within us. What is Satan? Destroys, commits inhumane acts. Satan. That's not us. Isn't that the devil up there in the sky somewhere? You see, as long as we don't see him, that's him. But the minute you've got to look at yourself, it's a little dangerous. So, the Zohar explains here that Satan is the accumulation on Rosh Hashanah, the accumulation of all of our own negative energy intelligent thoughts that subsequently became manifest. That's Satan. That's the one who's bringing us now into court. And he's going to testify. He is going to testify. One witness, Satan. He's going to testify. Okay? We're beginning to get a little of the picture of why it has to do with Rosh Hashanah. Because the real matter in court is never determined at this level. Wait a second. Am I trying to say that we go into court and there is a plaintiff and there's a defendant? That's all illusion? That's not the real stuff? Come on. No, I think maybe it all began on another level. What are you talking about? It begins on another level. That's only when you want to build a house, you see, or you want to open up a business. Yeah, of course all these things, all these thoughts have to precede that which ultimately became manifest on a physical level. But, okay, the same thing applies here in court. And they're not discussing, the Torah here is not discussing one witness, two witnesses, three. He's discussing if one witness wants to come on every inequity. If I borrowed money from you, Chaya, and I forgot, and you take me to court, right? Is there a sin? Is that a sin that you took me to court? And should I even consider it a sin? I claim that I really honestly forgot. And then, all of a sudden, Chaim produces a witness. And then, whatever has to be determined will be determined. Right? Why does the Torah say, L'chol avon? Raises the Zohar the question. Is that an inequity that you take someone into court? It's true. Rabbi Isaac Luria would never take anyone into court. I can't imagine why. But he would never take anyone into court, no matter what. Wouldn't go to court. It seems that going to court is a result of some Aveirah, some inequity that happened on another level that now is becoming manifest. But I'm innocent. I didn't do anything wrong. Don't we all say that when something happens? When something happens, and in fact, I just gave charity. How come it happened? Because we live in the instant corporeal reality level, that one thing in linear time. But linear time, you see, is only an illusion. It's only an illusion. When things happen on the physical level, it began long before, where thoughts were determining your actions. Now you want to know, but wait a second. But that happened 10 years ago. You know anything about quantum? Quantum says there's no time, space, and motion. That means there's no linear time. So when a physicist can say, did you see that footprint on the beach today? Don't tell anyone, but tomorrow, the guy who's going to make that print is going to appear. It's explainable, right? The print we see now is going to be made by that guy who's going to step on it tomorrow. You hear the kind of stuff they're teaching us, right? Because there is a realm, and that's what they're getting to now. There is a realm where there is no such thing as the division and fragmentation of time. It's all present at the same time, except because we live in this corporeal reality, things ultimately become manifest and have to become manifest that way. So this witness, Satan, lo yamus al pi ed echad. It says here, on every iniquity, you cannot pass judgment because of one witness. In other words, Satan says, look, here's all the prosecutor comes, here's all the inequities of this person. You know what has to happen. Put him right into the book of death. On Rosh Hashanah, the world is judged. But afterwards, through the Tekiyat Shofar, which creates a particular missile that is going to remove that negative energy, thought, intelligence that we created throughout the year, which stems from the central column. If you could begin to see a picture in advance, the minute they said 2 or 3, there could be 2, and there could be 3. In fact, only recently did I learn, the hydrogen is only of 2 elements, and the atom is of 3. It seems like there's 2 and 3. What does all that mean? It means only what they can observe. But if you discuss thought, energy, intelligence, then you know why there's a hydrogen factor and there's an element called atom. But in any event, at that point, when we blow the shofar, we cause a separation of Samael min HaMalchut from ourselves. We are Malchut. We are the desire to receive. In reality, there's nothing else that exists except the 99% of human beings. And with the blowing of the shofar, we have removed him. We have removed that negative energy from our essence, which is also negative energy. But we no longer associate, in spite of the fact that he is coming, this prosecutor, Satan. Az al pishnayim edim yakum davar. Then we say, what does it mean to? He in effect comes together with what? He and your negative thought and energy intelligence. No, the robberies we committed during the year, other acts of inhumanity to our fellow man. Doesn't have to mean clubbing the guy. There's a lot of other ways we can club someone to death. And he says, if you can separate him through the tekiyah, then you don't have 2, you see. You only have 1. Satan and your activities, your acts, those are 2. They both come to haunt you. Now it says that, a man's past comes back to haunt him, whatever that means. That's what it means that the 2 came. The 2 can do it when they're connected. But when they are only 1, when Satan stands by himself, without the evidence, without the material, and the Tekiyah does that, and I don't want to go into that, obviously. That is not, that's taken care of in the tapes. And it says, then you can mete out justice if there are 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, and that the dead person then can be put to death. Does that sound logical? The dead person can be put to death. Yamut hamet. For those of you who know Hebrew. Yamut hamet. If you have 2 or 3 witnesses, you can put the fellow to death. But the Torah already calls that defendant a dead person. What do you mean Yamut hamet? Ki hayat tzarich lomar yumat hachai. It should have said, questions the Zohar, you put to death a live person, but you can't put to death a dead person. Such a simple question. How come we didn't notice it? V'lama amar hamet el ramez al Samael shehu met me'ikaro. Who are we talking about? We're talking about Satan. Satan is dead. What does it mean, dead? There's no continuity. There's no sharing. When do you have continuity? When there's sharing. Like in the bulb. If that electricity didn't ultimately pass through the positive wire, we would have no light. It begins with the left pole, but it must somehow wind up becoming manifest through the right pole. It's a funny phenomenon which very few people really understand. But that's the essence of a bulb. When the electricity finally becomes revealed, it passes through the right. Because it's continuity. The Torah wants to tell you that dead individual, because what is Satan? All he can share is what? Death. Because he himself is only death. There is no life. And therefore the Zohar knows that what we're talking about here is about Rosh Hashanah. We are not talking about a matter in court. It's discussing elements that bring those matters into court. At that level of the real reality. How do you kill Satan? How do you kill Satan? Who is dead to begin with? But he has a function. To mete out death. Nothing more. With 2 witnesses. What do you mean with 2 witnesses? You're going to kill. In other words, we're not even talking about someone in court who committed a crime. We're talking now about how we can remove Satan. That's why this all has to do with the aspect of meting out judgment. We're nothing in the Torah, another aspect of the Zohar, which deals only with what goes on up there. How you straighten matters out. Up there is how you straighten out your matters and your life down here. But you can't straighten out anything here if all you're involved with is the corporeal level. And I don't say, let's forget it. Close up your business. That's not what we're talking about. But to recognize just that corporeal level as the reality, then you lost the show. You're not in control. You're in effect, like everything else at this level. And therefore, there is only one way. You have to have 2 witnesses. What are the 2 witnesses? One is of a sharing, and the other one is the restriction. And you learned in the Talmud Sefirot, how do you create circles of life energy, not death energy? Death energy, if you don't have a central column, if you don't have the filament, you cause death to that energy. The electricity came in. It wants to share. It wants to light up the room. What did you do to it? Without a filament, you killed it. We even use that expression, kill time. You kill a drawing by adding or matters that we use that expression. Here too. You want to kill it? You've got to use 2 witnesses, the 2 aspects, the right column and the column of energy. Well, how does Shlosha Eidim? But he also said about 3, right? He said 2 or 3. Also dealing with an energy level, and I'll leave it because for most of you, you didn't learn yet about there's closed doors to the warehouse of energy, and there's automatic open doors. Sometimes you don't have to open the door. You just step on the floor, and I don't know, some contraption there moves the doors open. You don't even do anything. Sometimes you have to reach out, right? At another level, you don't even have to reach out. Things just open up for you. Some people have to make extra effort, but when you use the 3-column system, when you're using these 3 witnesses, 3-column systems, in other words, you are taking the negative attitude. In other words, it's not a question of restriction. It's not a question of sharing, which are the 2 elements that can put an end and a stop to the roadblock. That's why I say in the tapes, we got to reach that energy store called Binah. And Satan puts up the roadblocks, so you can't pass through. And you don't get there, you don't get your energy for the year. So, the Tekiah, through that system, we remove the roadblocks. That's a lot of work. Because you make use of the right column, the sharing, and restriction. In other words, not everything in this world do I want restriction. But then there is another 3rd element. That you want everything in this world. Everything that you see you want. But you want it for the sake of sharing. That's different than just sharing, you see. That's different than sharing because, let's say if Rockefeller gave away a $50 bill, it's sharing, but you couldn't say he wanted those $20, and in spite of that intense desire to take that $20, he still shared it. That's the 3rd element. When you open up the 3rd element, when you operate on that 3rd element, things become a lot easier. The doors open up. That's the expression. There's menulah or the miftacha. There's 2 kinds of doors. Some that you have to work to open up, and some you just come to the door and it opens up. So let us hope we have a good year and we have our doors open for us wherever we have to go. Amen. You want to say a couple